Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little. Thank you very much for being here today for this webinar where I'm going to be reviewing 30 hands that I played live at 1-2 no limit. I suppose I should just ensure that everyone watching can see my screen. If you guys can let me know if you see my screen, please let me know that. All right. So I did play 1-2 no limit, and I actually ended up playing around 15 hours at Borgata. And over the course of that 15 hours, I ended up winning $650, which is a very good win rate. I probably ran hot to some extent, but at the same time, I got to experiment with a few plays, some of which worked and some that did not work, but we'll be going through all of those. I definitely learned a lot about the general players in these games. They definitely are slightly different than the players you encounter in high stakes. I mean, it's a well-known concept that as you move up in stakes, there are fewer and fewer weak players you can extract money from. But I guess the sophistication level of the amateur players definitely goes up as you play higher as well. And I think that's just because a lot of players, if they are legitimately bad, they are not going to survive at the high stakes games too long unless they're rich. Whereas in the smaller stakes games, they can survive much longer just because the general player pool is a little bit weaker. Somebody actually just asked a question on the Float the Turn forums, and they said, does 2-5, will the advice I give in this webinar also apply to 2-5 live? And I think the answer is definitely yes. You just have to realize that some of the amateur players will not have as many glaring flaws in their game for you to take advantage of, and therefore they are going to beat you sometimes. Whereas at 1-2, it's pretty hard to get stacked if you really do pay attention to what your opponents are going to be doing. And we'll review all of this as we go through these hands. If you have any questions about the hand that we are discussing, feel free to type it in. I'm more than happy to answer those questions. And we'll also have a question and answer session at the end of this webinar. So I am not going to be reviewing all of the hands that I played. I played a ton of hands, of course. The hands that will be skipped are the small pots where I put in less than 6 big blinds. This is usually when someone raises, I call, I flop nothing, they bet, and I fold. That happens, quite often. It's not like you make a good hand all the time in No Limit Hold'em. There are also a lot of limped pots where I miss. So there'll be 2 or 3 limpers. I'll limp in with a marginal hand like 10-8 suited or something like that, and I'll completely miss the flop, someone will bet, and I will just fold. I guess I should talk about how I generally do play some of these scenarios where, say, 3 or 4 people limp, I limp with 10-8 suited, the flop comes like Jack 8-4, so I have middle pair. If there's a bet and a call, I'm almost always folding in that scenario, and I was watching the general player pool, and a lot of those players call in that spot, trying to see if they improve to 2 pair, and I think what happens to them is they end up getting stacked a pretty good amount of the time when they do turn something like a 10, because quite often they'll be against Jack 10 or pocket jacks or bottom set, whatever that is, and they end up putting in their stack drawing nearly dead. I actually saw that happen quite often. So especially if we have to realize if you do call in that spot and you make 2 pair, you are still not trying to blast your stack into the pot. And I think a lot of players at this buy-in level did not really recognize that. So there are a lot of scenarios where I would just fold middle pair in that scenario and lose no money. And I think a lot of players end up losing a lot of money in that spot. And the other spots that we're not going to be discussing too much are spots where I raise pre-flop, maybe 1 or 2 guys call, I make a continuation bet, and win. So those are the 3 spots that come up fairly trivially. They happen all the time, and we will not be discussing those. All right, so we're going to be using some specific notations throughout this webinar. I'm going to discuss how I take notes at the table. First thing I do is I note the positions of all the players. So at any individual table, you'll see there are usually 9 or 10 seats. So in 1-2, I think there were 10 seats. So under the gun is first position. Player to that person's left is second, then third, then fourth. And then it's usually easier for me to count backwards from the button. But you guys know the small blind, big blind, and button. Player to the right of the button is the cutoff. The right to that player is the hijack, and to the right of that player is the low jack. And I think that a lot of older poker literature just sort of groups all of these players into like first, second, and third or middle position, fourth, low jack, and hijack are, I'm sorry, first, second, third are early position, fourth, fifth, and low jack are middle position. Then you have late position, the cutoff and the button. And I think that that definitely does not adequately describe the specific dynamics at the table. Because quite often, if, say, third position, fourth position, and hijack limp, that's very different than if first position, second position, and fourth position limp. Because quite often the earliest limpers are much stronger than the middle limpers. And it really is important to notate this somewhat accurately whenever you are taking notes. So this is how a typical hand will be outlined. I'll explain my note-taking process. If you want to actually know, and I made a video about how I take notes at the table, I believe it is at jonathanlittlepoker.com/notes. Let me just type that into my browser real fast and see if that is where it is. Yeah, so jonathanlittlepoker.com/notes. That will give you a video of how I take notes at the poker table so you can do this at yourself. All of these hands I write down. They take me maybe 20 or 30 seconds. And of course, I have gotten fairly good at it over time. But it does take a little bit of practice. But if you follow the outline I give in that video of how to take notes, you'll be able to take notes at the table as well. And you will definitely be able to take notes and improve your game as you progress. Ron says that the video is a bonus for the live in the live cache 1-2 folder as well, so that is perfect. So definitely check that out. I think that's very important. And you'll find that if you start sharing your hands with your friends, you will get much better at poker much faster compared to if you simply play and then think about the hands and then move on, or just play and don't even think about the hands. So I know that quite often especially when I write down my high-stakes tournament hands and talk to my friends about them, pretty much every day, there's one or two hands that we somewhat disagree on. And if we somewhat disagree on those, that means that it's usually a scenario where one of either I have a flaw in my game or my friends have a flaw in their games. And that's a good way to improve. And I think whenever you first start playing poker, posting hands in the poker forums, like the free Float the Turn forum that I run, will definitely help you progress as a poker player. All right, so we're just going to talk through these hands, and if you have any questions at all about any of these, definitely feel free to type them in. I'm more than happy to reply to any questions that come up. So what I do is I write down my hand, 7-6 suited. I write the stack, 200, and the position, the cutoff. All these hands were at 1-2. Normally I would write down the stakes or the blind level if it was a tournament, because that's, of course, very relevant. I also try to note whenever players have a smaller stack than me. That is a little bit hard to keep really accurate track of, but I do my best with it. All right, so here we have 7-6 suited and the cutoff. So second, third, and fourth limp, and I decide to limp. I suppose this is the first decision where a lot of people vary their game. And some people raise in the spot every time, some people limp every time, some people raise sporadically. My default strategy, at least going into these hands, was going to be to limp a lot of the time with hands that flop reasonably well. These are going to be hands like two big cards, suited, connected-ish cards, and reasonable aces. I'm not saying I'm limping stuff like ace 4 offsuit in this spot. So the hands that I'm raising in this scenario, I tended to raise the most premium hands. I guess this would maybe be easier if I used this Equilab program. So the hands that I'm raising in this scenario are going to be primarily my value hands. Someone is saying they cannot hear anything. Is anyone else having a problem hearing me right now? The hands I'm raising are be the value hands and then sporadic junkier hands. And that's going to be just random junk. Someone's saying they cannot see as well. Let's see. All right, seems like it's going fine for most people, so I think we're just going to have to go with that. Actually, let's see. I had a image somewhere. Okay, here it is. If you guys are having problems hearing me at any point throughout this webinar, because maybe my internet's not working great, maybe your internet's not working great, etc., you have to click on this section right here on your, I guess it's your dashboard is what it's called, and click on the telephone button. And that will give you a spot to call in. And from there, you will likely have better audio quality. So keep that in mind if you see that you are having a tough time hearing me. As for people who cannot see my screen, it seems like everyone else can. I can't do anything about that. Okay, so anyways, I tended to raise sort of the junkier hands that were not good enough to call with. And I was raising primarily in spots where I thought the initial limper is weak. The main limper you're concerned with is the first limper, because that's the guy who is way more likely to be trapping you. Once the first limper limps, the second, third, fourth, etc. limper, those usually have a much weaker range. So the top quadrant up here is primarily the value hands. And then I would just raise sporadic stuff like these hands. I'll go through a few of these hands throughout this. And all of these hands are not quite good enough to call a limp with, at least in my opinion. These are all fairly junky, right? All these other ones you can conceivably limp if you play well after the flop. All these hands sort of in the middle, especially the suited ones. I'm also limping with pairs. Stuff like pocket nines I'll tend to limp, although I'll raise. Same with eights, I'll raise sporadically. And then all of these hands are not really good enough to limp. So it's not that I'm raising these hands all the time, but these are hands that are not going to flop well enough. So I want to make it clear, it's not like I'm raising these every single time. I want to make that incredibly 100% as clear as I possibly can, that these hands are the ones that are the candidates to raise over the limps. Because these are hands that tend to be somewhat dominated, and if you raise over the limps, your opponents will quite often fold if you raise big enough, and that will win you the pot. Also, hands like ace-5 are generally not quite strong enough to raise over the limp because they tend to not flop too well. They tend to flop a hand that's very dominated. Donald asks, why would I raise with the junkier hands? And I'm raising with the junkier hands because they are not good enough to call with. And also, I don't want to only be raising with premium hands. If I only raise with premium hands, that allows my opponents to play fairly well against me. They can just fold, and it's not a big deal for them. Like if I'm only raising pocket tens or better and then ace-queen or better, my opponent should fold to my limp every time, and they often will. So in order to take advantage of your opponents who are maybe limping and then folding, because maybe you get a read that the initial limper is weak or something like that, you can pick up a lot of pots that you would normally just not be able to play. So you're raising usually fairly large, about the size of the pot or more, and you're doing that in order to try to just force your opponents off the hand pre-flop. In order to raise the size of the pot, these are some questions people emailed in, but a pot size raise equals 3 times the last bet plus any additional money in the pot. So let's say there are 5 limpers, okay? So pot size raise would equal 3 times the last bet, which is $2, because that was the last person who limped, plus, and I said there are 5 limpers in front of you, so that's $10 minus the last bet. You have to subtract the last bet. So that's $8 plus the blinds. So now we do 6 plus 8, which is 14 plus 3 equals $17, a $17 raise. That's if there are 5 limpers. And you have to ask yourself, in your games, whenever people put in $2, are they putting in $15 more? And some players would in this game, but you have to realize a lot of these players, especially if they're playing without $200 in their stack, they're not going to put in $17. They're going to be sitting there with pocket 7s and they're just going to fold. Or they're going to be sitting there with ace-5 suited and just fold. Because we are forcing them to put in a huge portion of their stack. Now, if you think they are all going to call your 17 raise because that's just what they do, you should probably consider raising even a little bit larger. So maybe make it 23 or something like that if you think that that's going to be something that will allow you to steal the pot. So anyways, you want to be raising with the junkier hands mainly so that you can force your opponents to fold. But, of course, you also don't want to be super easy to play against. So Donald says, do you think people at these games are aware of how frequently you are raising? I mean, I wasn't raising over their limps very often. I think over the course of the 15 hours, I did it maybe 5 or 6 times, and one time actually, I think it worked every time except for once, and we'll go over that time where it failed. And that's mainly just because I had a bad read on the opponents. But I really did it when I thought the initial limpers were very weak, and I had a hand that did not flop well enough. Dave asked, do you find that 3-bets are rare versus your raises? I think whenever people were 3-betting me, they tend to have a very strong hand. So like say I raised to $6 or $8, $7. I was tending to raise to 7. If someone is re-raising me, it was almost always a strong hand, at least in my mind. They could have been bluffing me frequently, but I don't think that was happening a lot of the time. Samuel says, if the early position limper puts in 17, the others tend to call along. Yeah, and maybe that is the case. I think that once the first guy calls, the others are way more likely to call. But still, at the same time, you have to realize that, well, at least in this game, I don't think very many people were calling. Usually one guy would call, and then the others would fold. Or one guy would call, 2 guys would call, then everyone would call. Then you just recognize your bluff with the 10-5 suited failed, and you give up unless you flop good. So, I mean, we'll go through that as we progress. And then Earl asks, do you feel that you are more loose aggressive or tight aggressive? Well, so I think you have to be aware of what's going on at the table. I definitely don't classify myself as exclusively a loose aggressive player or exclusively a tight aggressive player. I classify myself as a good player. And there are times where you want to be very aggressive. Like, for example, when there are 5 limpers and all of them are clearly weak, that's a time where you want to be really loose and aggressive. There are other times where you think the initial limper has aces where you definitely do not want to be loose and aggressive. And that happens post-flop as well. There are spots where no one has anything and it's just clear, and you can bet and steal the pot. Dave says that he sees a lot of players at 1-2 raise big to like $20 or $45, huge raises, to protect their big pairs. Seems like a waste to simply pick up a few dollars. Well, yeah, it's a disaster. That's why these games are so incredibly easy, because all of these opponents who raise huge with their aces, they're taking their aces and they're throwing them in the trash. And if you listen to what your opponents are telling you, you can really get off the hook. And I do get off the hook a few times in these hands. All right, so anyways, let's start going through some of these. Otherwise, we'll never get done. All right, so this was early in the session. You see I have 200. I bought in for 200. I think you could actually buy in for a maximum of 300. But I wanted to try to simulate what I thought the standard, the standard conditions of a game, of most 1-2 games are. And the players' stacks are ranging between like $40 and $400, give or take. All right, so anyways, second, third, fourth limp in. I limp in with 7-6 suited. The blinds come in as well. Flop comes 8-4-2. And I notate the suits when they matter. So here I have 2 spades. There's 1 spade on the board. And then the turn was not relevant. The turn suit was not relevant, at least for me. All right, so they check to me. And I bet $10 into the $13 pot with the double gut shot. Notice, with the gut shot. So notice a 5 gives me a straight. This is a spot where you can check or you can bet, but you have to realize that if you check, you're very likely not winning this pot. And if you bet and say one guy calls, there are going to be a lot of good turn and river cards for you to continue betting. And that's just because the board is all low. It'd be a little bit different if the board was something like Jack 8-4. I'd be a little bit less inclined to bet on Jack 8-4 than 8-4-2, because when the Jack is out on the flop, it's less likely an overcard or a scary card in general will appear on the turn. But on these low card boards, the board is almost certainly going to get scarier one way or the other. Either a straight card's going to come or an overcard's going to come. And that's going to give me more bluffing opportunities. Notice that actually if a 7 or a 6 comes, I get a pair, which is great. If a 5 comes, I have the nuts. If a 3 comes, I'm probably giving up. If an 8, a 4, or 2 comes, I'm also giving up. But any overcard, I'm usually going to be betting again. If one guy calls. If multiple people call, I'm usually just going to be done with the hand and not put any more money in the pot unless I improve. So that's my general strategy for the flop play. Someone's again saying no video. I honestly don't know what to do if there is no video on your end. I will be sending a recording to everyone, so be aware of that. And I'm also talking through everything. So worst case scenario, you'll hear me talking about them. But seems like everyone else has good video. Someone's suggesting reboot your computer if your video is not working. Or maybe re-enter the webinar or something like that. All right, so anyways, I bet the flop. One guy calls, one big blind calls. Big blind call usually is going to be some marginal hand. Like I said, it was fairly clear to me that people were calling with all sorts of junk just because they think that's what they're supposed to do. They would call with something like 5-4 here and get out of the way. All right, turns the jack. My opponent checks. This also implies my opponent checks whenever I don't write what he does. My opponent checks. I bet 18. He calls. So when he calls again, notice that I was betting 18 into a $33 pot, so about half pot. I was not necessarily trying to get my opponent to fold an 8 at this point with this bet. I was more so just trying to get him to fold all of his worst hands, the absolute trashy ones, and go from there. I thought if he had an 8, he'd probably call this bet, and I would usually be giving up on the river if an overcard did not come to the 8. I think an 8 is most of my opponent's range when he calls the bet, is basically what I'm saying. He could also still be in here with 5-4 or ace-2 or something like that. But when the king came, that gave me a really clear bluffing spot. Of course, I shouldn't have a king too often, right? And I think a lot of high-stakes players will look at this and realize, oh, we shouldn't have a king very often, so I should be calling this a lot. But in the lower stakes games, I don't think people recognize when a scary card is not actually a scary card. I mean, given that I bet the flop, there is no way this king should have improved my hand. So I'm actually representing a very thin value range, but I don't think that really matters if your opponents just say, oh man, the jack came and the king came, now my 8 or my 4 or my 2 is obviously no good. And for that reason, I think it's the spot where I need to bet. So remember, the pot was 33 on the flop plus 8 plus 36, so 60-something, and I'm betting 52. I wanted to make a fairly large bet just to try to really ensure my opponent folds an 8 or worse. And he did fold. Usually in these spots, your opponents will tank forever, and you have to become very comfortable sitting there getting stared down. And I mean, I don't really have a problem with that because that happens in tournaments all the time, but I think a lot of the players in these games got really uncomfortable whenever they were getting stared at, and you have to become very, very comfortable with that if you are going to be bluffing in good spots. Dan asks, is the ace on the river a good card to bluff? Yeah, I'd be bluffing on any queen, ace, queen, or ace, king, or queen every time. A 10 or a 9 I would consider betting. 10 and 9s aren't quite as good because your opponent's 8 hands are usually going to be 10, 8, 9, 8, 8, 7, 7, 8, 6, etc., etc. If the river was a 7 or a 6, I'd probably not bet because I think it's going to be too likely that he is going to call with an 8 at that point. So that's my general plan. Ace, king, queen, I'm going to definitely continue betting. But I do think the turn bet gets the opponent off a lot of 4s and 2s, and maybe that's not accurate. Maybe the right play here is to bet more like 32 on the turn and then give up on all the rivers. But I'm a pretty big fan of firing 3 barrels whenever I have the opportunity compared to 2. I mean, well, there are some spots. Maybe we'll see some as we go through these hands. But this is a spot where it's very clear that if you bet the turn, you need to bet the river. So we pick up that pot right off the bat. It's always nice. All right, jack 4 of clubs on the button. So 3rd, 4th, low jack cutoff, limp, I raise to 18. So here's an example of this right off the bat. And remember, this was clearly in that range that I described earlier where it's not quite good enough to call. So I raise, and only the 3rd position guy calls, the initial limper. And someone said earlier that the first guy called, all of them call, but here's an example where it just didn't happen. One guy called and the others folded. So flop comes king 6-5, he checks, I bet 18, and I win. And notice that 18 is actually less than half pot, right? I think a lot of people, well, you have to realize, if my opponent calls this flop bet, I'm not going to say always, but quite often he will have a king or better. And if he has something like pocket 10s here, he'll just fold. And this is, of course, very player dependent, right? This is a spot where I think that this guy in particular, if I remember right, it was this probably 60-year-old guy who was somewhat conservative. I thought that he was one of these guys who's going to play very fit or fold. And that means that if he does not have a good hand, he's just going to get out of the way. And quite often these players, if they do have something like ace-king, they'll just check raise you or check raise all in or something like that right on the flop. And that makes your play really, really easy. Dave says that to them, the 18 bet may look like ace-king on a king XX board. And maybe it does, but really what betting 18 does is it allows me to bluff very cheaply. And also, it makes my opponent's errors significantly larger when they are folding the best hand. And also, whenever I do have a good hand, betting small will keep them in and quite often not allow them to make such easy folds with their reasonable hands. And so whenever I bet this, I recognize if my opponent calls, I'm probably done with it, unless maybe the turn's an ace. And I'm okay with that. And so my bet on the flop does not need to work very often at all to show a profit. And it's probably going to work something like 60 or 70% of the time. So seems like a pretty good spot to throw out the bluff. And this one worked as well. Dave asked, how often was I continuation betting? Richard says, I see that as on a 3, you are not done. I'm not sure what, I'm sorry, Samuel says that. I'm not sure what you're saying, Samuel. If the turn's a 3, I'm giving up. I'm not betting again on a lot of the turns. Oh, you say, okay, so say the turn's a 3 and I improve to a straight draw. Yeah, okay, so let's talk about that. Say the turn's a 3, I get a 4, and I make a straight draw. I'm probably not going to be betting on that card because when my opponent calls the flop, I think he has a king. And one thing I figured out really fast in these games is you are not trying to bluff your opponents off top pair. If your opponents have top pair, they are not folding. So if I think my opponent's going to stick around on the flop with only top pair or better, or primarily top pair or better, I'm just going to check behind the turn and try to realize my equity. If my opponent bet the river and I miss, obviously I fold. But if my opponent checks the river and I still have nothing, that would be a tough one. You could probably go either way, but your hand does not look like a king at that point, so I'd probably just give up. Then Nell says, what if you flopped a pair with the jack-4? Well, if it's top pair, I'm probably going to still bet just as... I'm probably going to be betting 100% of flops for 18 in this scenario. There are really no boards where I think my opponent's going to defend 60% of the time, or something like that, which is roughly what he needs to be doing if I'm betting this size on the flop. So I think we can fairly blindly continuation bet in this scenario. And someone asked how often was I continuation betting, and I don't know the exact percentage or anything like that, but in heads up pots when check to, heads up 3-bet pots when check to, or heads up raise pots when check to, I'm betting pretty often. But multi-way, I definitely played significantly more straightforward. And Robert says, was this one 15-hour session or did I break it up? No, this was, I think, 3 or 4 sessions. Well, actually, there's a question about that later that we will go over from someone who could not attend live. If you guys ever want to send your questions to the webinar ahead of time, or if you know you will not be here to attend live, feel free to email them in. And don't do that now, but if you wanted to email them in for the next webinar or something like that, definitely do that, and I'm happy to answer. All right, so ace-king, low jack seat. I raised to 7, so I decided to make my standard raise to 7. I could easily see min raising being best in these games. And good and well, no one min raises in these games. They're all raising to 7, 10, 15, or something like that pre-flop. Everyone at my table seemed to make it between like 8 and 10 pre-flop. I didn't encounter too many players who were blasting it to 20 or anything like that, although I'm sure they exist. I've heard about them. And very briefly, I guess, if you do see someone raising gigantic like that, just fold everything and wait for good cards. So you don't have to defend very often when your opponent's putting in $20 pre-flop. Don't feel like you have to call with ace jack offsuit and 8-7 suited and stuff like that. Just fold and wait for your top 5% hands. That makes the game really easy when they're blasting it. So anyways, I raised to 7. A cutoff tight guy goes all in for 60. So I was not loving making this call, but I don't really see how I could possibly fold. You have to realize when you have ace-king in your hand, facing an all-in, it's way more likely your opponent has either ace-king as well, or queens, jacks, or tens, than he has exactly aces. So you have to realize you're roughly flipping, and you do not need to win too often to profit. The way you have to figure out how often you need to win is you take the total size of the pot you will be getting in. So it'll be his 60 plus my 60 plus the blind, so 123. That's going to be the total pot. So we take how much more we have to put in, which is 53 divided by 123 equals. You see we need to win 43% of the time, right? And let's say we give our opponent a range like this. This is about as, well, let's say he's only shoving aces, kings, queens, jacks, and ace-king, which I think most short stacks are certainly shoving. We have ace-king offsuit. You see we do win 40% of the time against this super nitty range, right? So if your opponent is legitimate super net, I need to win 43%, and I'm only going to win 40%, so I actually should fold. But I don't think too many people are that nitty. I mean, the guy only has 30 big blinds, so if he's shoving like ace-queen suited and pocket tens, notice that's not making the range much wider. But it starts to get very close to a call, and then if he starts shoving like ace-queen offsuit, pocket nines, then it becomes a very, very easy call. So anytime you're in a scenario like this, you have to realize that worst case scenario, we're losing a tiny amount, But best case scenario, we're profiting huge. And of course, if my opponent's really shoving a lot, like say he's shoving, ace 5 suited or something because he's blatantly crazy, then we have a very, very easy call. So Dave says that he finds a lot of older, tight guys would do the same with king or better when their stack is so short. Well, yeah, I think my opponent would do the same thing with kings or better. And notice that was in the range, right? I say he's shoving aces and kings. So it's not like I'm saying these are not part of his range. I was just saying that he's also going to be doing it with these other hands as well. You always have to be thinking about the total range. And against this absolute nit range of aces, kings, queens, jacks, and ace-king, it's just barely, barely bad. So pretty easy call spot. He had pocket tens, I lose, and not much to that. Actually, I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but I wanted to discuss it right now. Whenever I lost this hand, everyone at the table was like, "Oh man, tough luck." Like they were trying to console me for losing a coin flip. And I realized later that everyone in the games absolutely hated losing any significant pot. And you have to realize, like, this is an absolutely inconsequential hand, right? I did nothing wrong. My opponent did nothing wrong. We got it all in, and one of us is going to win, one of us is going to lose, and we move on. There's no point in acting as if you are unlucky or getting pissed because you lost or anything like that. And you definitely don't need to care about losing pots. I think a lot of the players at the table really hated losing pots, and they hated getting outdrawn. And they were willing to throw a lot of value in the trash to ensure that that did not happen to them.